All right, so Ernie 5.1 just landed a 1,223 score on LM Arena Search Arena, ranking 4th globally and 1st among Chinese models. And I wanted to see how it actually stacks up against ChatGPT 5.6 Soul in a real head-to-head. This is May 2026. Both models are live, and the stakes are real if you're picking one for production work. I ran Ernie 5.1 against ChatGPT 5.6 Soul across 4 tests using verified sources only, no vendor briefings, no sponsored placements. Honestly, the thing that surprised me most wasn't which model won. It was how much of this comparison I couldn't actually make because one side had almost no published data at all. And that gap has real consequences for your workflow. So this one's for developers and teams deciding where to put their API budget right now. Pick the wrong model, and you're either locked out of an API that requires China-based verification, or you're shipping English code with a model that hallucinates function signatures. And both of those are real costs, not hypothetical ones, which is exactly what I wanted to get to the bottom of. Test 1 is multilingual and Chinese language accuracy. The failure mode here is super concrete. You ship a product to Chinese-speaking users, the model gets the cultural phrasing wrong, and your users notice immediately. That's a trust problem, not a benchmark problem. And it can tank retention fast if you pick the wrong model for the job. What I found here is pretty one-sided. Ernie 5.1 scored 1,223 on LM Arena Search Arena, 4th globally. And community reports consistently put it at number 1 for Chinese linguistic nuance. What surprised me is I couldn't find a single published Seoul tier benchmark for ChatGPT on this dimension. So on screen, you'll see that right side just says no published figure across the board. Take this with a grain of salt though, because Ernie trails on broad knowledge, MMLU Pro versus GPT 5.5 per press, and the 1,223 LM Arena score is vendor claimed from May 2026. The community consensus on Chinese nuance is real, but it's community reported, not independently benchmarked. So if your use case is broad multilingual knowledge rather than specifically Chinese, the gap here is honestly a lot smaller. Ernie 5.1 takes this one, and it's not particularly close on Chinese-specific tasks. I was expecting ChatGPT to at least have some Seoul tier data to compare, but there's just nothing published, so Ernie wins by default as much as by merit. Running score, Ernie 5.11, ChatGPT 5.6 Seoul 0. Test 2 is reasoning and coding. The concrete failure, you ask the model to write a function, it confidently returns something that looks right, but the signature is completely wrong. Your code breaks in production, and you spent an hour debugging something the model hallucinated. That's not a theoretical risk with Ernie. Developers have actually reported it happening. Ernie 5.1 posts a vendor-claimed AIME 26 score of 99.6 with tool used, which is honestly an insane number if it holds up. But I looked hard for any Seoul tier reasoning or coding benchmark from OpenAI and found nothing published. So on screen, you'll see the ChatGPT column is blank across IMA 26, GPQA, and agentic benchmarks, which makes any numeric comparison pretty much impossible. Now that 99.6 AIMA 26 score is vendor self-reported and unconfirmed by any independent benchmark I could find. And real user reports flag Ernie hallucinating function signatures on English coding tasks, which tracks with press noting it trails GPT-5 and Claude 3.5 on English code. So the math competition number looks great, but English coding reliability is a pretty different story. This one's a tie, and I'll be honest, I was expecting Ernie's IME 26 number to at least force a partial win, but without any Seoul tier data to compare it against, calling a winner here would just be making stuff up. So we're calling it tie. Running score is Ernie 5.11, ChatGPT 5.6 Seoul 0 with 1 tie. Test 3 is API pricing and access. The failure mode, you budget your project around the price you found online, you go to sign up, and you hit a wall because the API requires a mainland China phone number or business verification, and you're sitting outside China. Your timeline slips, your cost estimate is wrong, and you're starting over. Ernie 5.1 has a press verified price 59 cents per million input tokens and $2.65 per million output tokens on Qianfan, which is actually pretty competitive. What surprised me is I couldn't find a single verified pricing URL for ChatGPT 5.6 Seoul anywhere. So on screen, the Seoul pricing column just reads no verified figure, which makes a side-by-side cost comparison impossible to do, honestly. The catch with Ernie's pricing is that rate only matters if you can actually access the API. International developers consistently report hitting a verification wall that doesn't exist with ChatGPT. So Ernie might be cheaper on paper, but if you're outside China, that price is kind of irrelevant until you clear the account setup, which isn't guaranteed. Another tie, and this one genuinely surprised me because I thought pricing would be the easiest dimension to compare. Ernie has a published rate card and Seoul doesn't, but access friction cancels out a lot of that advantage for international teams. Scoreboard stays at Ernie 5.11, ChatGPT 5.6 Seoul 0, now with 2 tied. Test 4 is response speed and latency. The concrete failure, you're outside China, You're literally hammering the Ernie API in a real workflow, and every request is slower than expected because the model is hosted on Baidu's Chanfan infrastructure and you're routing through extra geographic hops. That lag adds up fast in any kind of agentic or high volume setup. I looked for hard latency numbers, tokens per second, end-to-end response time, anything published for either model, and found nothing. What I did find is that Ernie's MOE architecture activates less than 3% of parameters per query, which community reports say keeps latency low under enterprise load. But on screen, you'll see no published tokens per second for either side. So raw speed comparison just isn't possible here. The MOE architecture is genuinely interesting for latency in theory, and Ernie's platform handles 16.5 billion API calls per day at scale, which is a real signal. But if you're outside China, the theoretical advantage gets eaten by geographic routing overhead, and ChatGPT's global CDN infrastructure avoids that entirely. So the gap depends almost entirely on where you're located. Try it again. Because without hard latency numbers for either model, I can't call a winner on the data. I was expecting at least one published tokens per second figure somewhere, but neither vendor has that for Soltier or Ernie 5.1 right now. Final scoreboard: Ernie 5.11, ChatGPT 5.6, Sol 0, 3 tied. Okay, so here's where Ernie 5.1 is the clear pick. Chinese language and search augmented tasks. It's the #1 Chinese model on LM Arena Search Arena. Full stop. Its vendor-acclaimed AIME 26 score of 99.6 with tool use is the strongest single benchmark number in this full comparison, and its API pricing at 59 cents input and $2.65 output per million tokens is published and press verified, which Sol just doesn't have. Now here's where ChatGPT 5.6 Sol wins cleanly. International access, no China phone number, no business verification, any developer, anywhere gets an API key today. Geographic latency outside China is better because OpenAI's global infrastructure doesn't carry Baidu's routing overhead. And on English coding reliability, user reports and press both flag Ernie hallucinating function signatures, which is a real production risk ChatGPT's lineage doesn't have to the same degree. Honestly, I was expecting a cleaner fight, but the Soltier data gap made that impossible. So here's the decision rule. If your users speak Chinese and you're building inside China, Ernie 5.1 is the obvious pick. It's purpose-built for that and priced competitively. If you're an international developer doing English coding or reasoning work, ChatGPT 5.6 Sol wins on access, latency, and English code reliability, even without hard Soltier benchmarks to prove it.